So hi everyone, we're recording this video today to talk a little bit about the context around genetic discrimination in Canada. My name's Abby Rudd, I'm a research assistant at the GDO Central location in Montreal, Quebec.
And my name is Thea Oberoi, and I'm the Associate Director of the Genetic Discrimination Observatory.
So I was hoping to get us started by talking a little bit about how genetic discrimination manifests in Canada, where people's concerns are, and where we actually have evidence of its occurrence.
That's a great place to start. And what I want to really highlight is that genetic discrimination does arise here in Canada, but the extent and the scope to which it occurs is still somewhat unclear, and the evidence of its occurrence is still somewhat limited. At the same time, where we have seen some instances and where fears arise are really primarily within the employment sector, also in life and health insurance, where there's fears from people around the way in which their genetic data may be used, where they could actually potentially be denied coverage or possibly even face higher premiums. At the same time, I want to also highlight the importance of just the way in which genetic testing can reinforce stigmas and the way in which that can actually interfere with existing interpersonal relationships.
Right, and I want to follow that up by talking a little bit about what legal protections we have in place in Canada. So some of you might be aware that Canada passed the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act in 2017. If you could tell us about its provisions.
Yes, just like a number of jurisdictions now that they've sought to address genetic discrimination, Canada passed the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. And it primarily occurs and it actually regulates contractual settings where it prohibits, for the most part, the non-consensual use or disclosure of a person's genetic data. So without a person's written explicit consent, cannot be using or disclosing, test results in and of itself. At the same time, it really broadly functions as a criminal law. And what it looks to do is it prohibits or it makes it a criminal offense then to require a person to undergo or to disclose their genetic test results. That doesn't mean that there are no exceptions. We do see exceptions today, primarily within the context of research and also for health professionals in the context of patient care.
Right, and I think it's important to bring up here that there are criticisms of the GNDA. I think the most notable is really around the consent-based nature of the model. And the worry there is that people who are unaware of their rights to withhold that information from insurers, from employers, might be compelled to give the information away. And then the fear there would be that they are vulnerable to discrimination that could have been prevented. And to follow that up, I'd like to mention as well that the GNDA is not Canada's only legal protection. It's relatively less discussed, but our Canadian Human Rights Act was actually amended to include genetic characteristics as an explicit ground for discrimination in 2018.
I think this is a really important point to note. And that's because we don't always think about it, but genetic discrimination really is also a matter of human rights. And what happens is that if a person then is actually going to be denied access to health services in and of itself, other social services, or if you cannot even actually benefit today from medical progress or the advances from science itself, that constitutes a human rights violation. So yes, I think what we want to highlight then is, yes, we saw amendments then to Canada's Human Rights Act, but we also saw an amendment in that itself to the Labor Code. But what is important to note that there are limits and that this doesn't apply necessarily to private actors.
Right, and that's super important to think about, given that, like we said at the beginning, people's fears and what evidence we do have of occurrence are happening in places like employment and insurance primarily. These are private sectors. So a potential resolution in Canada at least would be to be amending provincial and territorial human rights documents with genetic characteristic protections. And one last note before we wrap up is, I think going forward, what we're really going to need is more evidence-based studies around the frequency and the contexts where it's currently happening beyond the fears that people are expressing. So I hope this was informative. Thanks for sticking with us, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.